So I was walking through downtown Boston and I came across this library, and something really rubbed me the wrong way about this facade and statue. Like, these people are basically random historical figures. Why are they here? Why are they grouped this way? Can I make a tier list of all of these people? Questions whose answers are McKim, Mead, and White did it, a Harvard grad did it as a prank, and I don't think I can do a 400-person tier list in under 20 minutes. In 1852, the Massachusetts legislature founded the Boston Public Library. 2 years later, the Boston Public Library first opened to the public. But it wasn't until 1880 that the Massachusetts legislature set aside this land in Copley Square for a new building, where they would then move the Boston Public Library to. Over the next 7 years, there was a series of failed competitions to decide how this library was going to be made. And finally, McKim, Mead, and White were hired to design the new library. Construction began the following year in 1888, and construction wouldn't finish until 1912. I want to start by characterizing McKim, Mead, and White for you. At this point, they're all young and haven't done any big building projects. They would later go on to make Madison Square Garden, the Vanderbilt Mansion, Penn Station, the 1902 White House renovation, and buildings at the University of Virginia, Harvard University, and Columbia University. But at this point, they hadn't done any big building projects. Of the men, McKim had the most equity and would later become the most famous. Mead was the most level-headed and tended to be seen as quite quiet. And White was the most creative and often viewed as unrealistic. Multiple sources have mentioned a caricature drawn where Mead is on the ground struggling to control two airborne kites labeled as McKim and White. I can't find the actual cartoon, but I found a sketch of the three of them made by the artist of the cartoon. And if I just, put this here, and then I make the kites like this, then, yeah, it's something like this, Kind of like to think of them like Bogus Bunsen Bean from the Fantastic Mr. Fox series. Over the next 4 years, they do work on the building, and the trustees of the Boston Public Library select 600 names to be placed on the facade. And they tell McKim, Mead, and White to organize them however they want. So they have an intern do it, a Harvard intern, and he does the funniest prank you could possibly do. So he organizes them to some extent with some characterization, although it's somewhat random, and he also makes some acrostics of the name McKim, Mead, and White, and there is a lot of pushback against it. There was an article put into the Boston Globe that reads, "Acrostic has got to go. Ultimatum of trustees of public library. Architect's advertisement blamed on clerk, who is in Europe. Prophet grouped with poets, Indians and Greeks in objectionable tablet. The acrostic must go, so say the trustees of the public library." On the extreme left of the facade front of the new public library building are chiseled the following names: Moses, Cicero, Kalidasa, Socrates, Milton, Mozart, Euclid, Euclides, Dante, Rand, Herod, Irving, and Erasmus. These names form an acrostic, and the first letters spelling McKim, Mead, and White, the firm name of the architect who furnished the plans of the building. This acrostic is said to be the work of a clerk in the office of the architects who is now in Europe. Consequently, he is a handy person to lay the blame on. Moses and Cicero, the idea of those names hobnobbing together. We'll have to get Mr. Cicero out of this scrape. Washington Irving and Titian chumming together. Preposterous. Accordingly, yesterday afternoon when the trustees met, Mr. Prince brought up the matter, and it was voted in short order to have the names forming the objectionable acrostic erased. Mr. McKim is in Chicago, but his superintendent was present at the meeting and will see that the order is executed. A suitable group will take the place of the names erased. Yet, as Mr. Prince remarked, acrostics have fooled lots of people. Acrostics have fooled lots of people. This is kind of ridiculous to me. Why is it that artists can sign their work and building owners can put their names in big letters on front of the building, but architects can't sign their own buildings? So now, in 1895, the library opens, and the art is not even done on the outside. So the team gets a guy named Augustus St. Gaudens to do a lot of the sculpture work on the outside. He was the guy who made the caricature drawing from before that I mentioned with the kites. He was quite an old man at the time, and he got to choose 16 special names to go on some pedestals in front of the facade. His idea at the time was to do 2 pedestals, the first being labor seated between science and art, and the second being law seated between power and religion. He made mock-ups of them, but by the time the library got around to having the funding and approval for the statues, it was 1911, and St. Gaudens had already died in 1907. He had already died 4 years before that. They ended up getting his student, Bella Pratt, to complete the statue. He scrapped the labor, he scrapped the law, he scrapped the power, he scrapped the religion, and instead he just made 2 statues, science and art. They had 16 names on them, which was controversial for their own reason, namely that they didn't include any American artists. I'm not gonna read this. You can read it if you want. Anyways, these 2 statues with these artists and scientists are installed in 1912, and that's kind of the end of the facade being done. So that's 32 years of construction from them starting to produce it until the final finishing touches are being put on the facade. Okay, so back to McKim, Mead, and White. And the building actually was eventually named after McKim, which is kind of ironic because at the time of construction, he wasn't allowed to sign it, if you remember from the acrostic. Why was it named after McKim and not named after McKim, Mead, and White? First of all, McKim was the first name in the trio because he had more equity. He actually had 42% of the equity, while the other 2 had less. Also, Mead didn't like the fame, and he was not a big fan of the spotlight, and so he kind of faded into obscurity intentionally. White was shot to death at Madison Square Garden, which was a building that he had constructed by the husband of a lady with which he had had an affair. And this is what I love about walking around cities. I mean, I find this facade, and I think it's a little bit strange, and so then I get to do some research. I get to learn a ton of history. I get to learn about a prank. I get to learn about murder, and I get to have a really interesting learning experience and appreciate the art of this building. Also, if anyone wants to read a paper about why architects don't get to sign their buildings, I recommend this one. I'll link it in the description with all of my sources.